The 1930s were not just an economic collapse, they were a collapse of faith. Banks failed, currencies crumbled, nations that once ruled empires suddenly couldn't feed their own people. Germany drowned in inflation, Britain faced debt, and France lost confidence in its own franc. Everywhere the question was the same. Where could value hide when every promise was broken? Across the ocean, one country appeared untouched by ruin. Its cities still glowed at night. Its banks still opened every morning. The United States, vast, isolated, and seemingly invincible, became the last vault of trust in a distrustful world. In their panic, governments made a choice that would change history. They loaded their gold, the very backbone of their wealth, onto ships and sent it west, across cold waters to America. It was supposed to be temporary, a safeguard, not a surrender. But gold has a strange gravity. Once it moves, it rarely returns. In less than a decade, the world's fortunes were concentrated inside another nation's borders. And America, quietly, began to understand the power of custody. That control doesn't always require conquest. Sometimes it only requires trust, because in the end, the world didn't lose its gold in battle. It gave it away, willingly, fearfully, to a country that promised safety and found something far greater. Before the Second World War, the world agreed on one truth: gold was money, and money was gold. Every note, every coin, every promise from a government was only as strong as the metal locked in its vaults. It wasn't faith that gave currency value. It was weight. Pure, shining, measurable weight. Nations didn't just guard gold, they worshipped it. Because whoever held the most could write the rules of trade, dictate the flow of credit, and define what value even meant. But by the early 1930s, America had already begun rewriting those rules. In 1933, President Roosevelt made a stunning move. He ordered all American citizens to surrender their gold to the government. Overnight, private ownership became illegal. Families turned in heirlooms, coins, bars, not by choice but by law. The government bought them cheap, then locked them away. To the public, it was a patriotic sacrifice to stabilize the economy. In reality, it was consolidation, the gathering of power under one roof. By the end of the decade, America held the largest gold reserves on Earth. It wasn't luck, it was design. While other nations struggled to survive, the U.S. quietly built a fortress of metal and trust. And in that moment, the foundation of a global empire was already forming. Because gold wasn't just a store of value, it was leverage. Every country needed it. Every currency depended on it. And soon, every vault that mattered would echo with the same truth. The more gold America held, the less control the rest of the world had. By the late 1930s, Europe was preparing for war, and for the first time in centuries, its rulers feared not just invasion, but disappearance. Cities were arming, borders were closing, and gold, that ancient anchor of power, became the most endangered treasure on the continent. Every government understood one truth: if their vaults fell, their nations would follow. In London, French diplomats whispered about secret shipments. In Amsterdam, crates were marked as machinery, but inside were gold bars, wrapped in cloth and guarded by silence. Britain alone sent more than 1,500 tons across the Atlantic. France shipped billions worth through perilous waters. Dutch ships carried their fortune under the constant threat of German U-boats, knowing one torpedo could erase a century of savings. The world's wealth was moving, not through trade, but through fear. And on the other side of the ocean, America received it all. Ship after ship unloaded the reserves of entire nations into the vaults of New York and Fort Knox. Officially, the gold was in custody, waiting for the day it would be returned. But deep down, everyone knew what was really happening. The act of sending it, of surrendering it, changed ownership in spirit, if not on paper. To protect their wealth, Europe had handed it to another master. They had saved their gold, but lost their control. And somewhere within the quiet halls of Fort Knox, America realized that protection was the most profitable form of power. Because when fear rules the world, the one who offers safety doesn't need to ask for control. It's given freely. As the war ignited, America transformed from a distant observer into the world's vault. By 1941, over half of the planet's monetary gold rested beneath U.S. soil, silent, heavy proof of global dependence. Fort Knox gleamed as the symbol of trust, and the underground chambers of the New York Federal Reserve became the most guarded square mile in the world. Nations spoke of temporary custody, but the truth was already shifting. What began as protection was turning into possession. In Washington, policymakers recognized what few others dared to see. Control of gold meant control of the future. Every ingot stored in American vaults gave the U.S. not just wealth, but leverage, a quiet authority that stretched beyond borders. The world's money was now measured by what lay under American ground. But trust is a delicate form of power. The moment it is accepted, it begins to transform. America had not asked for this empire, yet it grew inside its vaults, bar by bar, ship by ship. And somewhere between duty and ambition, the line blurred. The nations believed they had placed their treasure in safe hands. They didn't realize they were handing over their economic soul. Because in the grand theater of war, gold was not just a metal, it was the script. And America, the so-called custodian, was quietly becoming the author. When the war finally ended in 1945, Europe was rubble, Asia was starving, and the only industrial giant left standing was the United States. Its cities were untouched, its factories roared with production, and deep beneath its soil lay the greatest treasure hoard the world had ever known. America now held almost 3/4 of all official gold reserves on Earth. The question wasn't whether it would lead, it was how it would rule. In July 1944, even before the final bombs fell, delegates from 44 nations gathered in a quiet New Hampshire resort called Bretton Woods. They came to rebuild the world economy, but the outcome was already written. America, rich in gold and power, dictated the terms. The dollar would now be the anchor of global trade, not because others chose it, but because they had no alternative. Every foreign currency would be tied to the US dollar, and the dollar itself would be as good as gold. On paper, the world agreed. In practice, it surrendered. The gold that once backed their currencies now sat behind American locks, and in exchange, they received pieces of paper, dollars, that could only be redeemed through Washington's permission. It was a quiet form of empire, built not on conquest, but on custody. As nations signed the Bretton Woods Agreement, few realized they were giving up something far greater than sovereignty. They were giving up autonomy over value itself. The dollar standard was presented as stability, but behind it was a new hierarchy. The issuer ruled and the holders obeyed. What looked like the restoration of order was, in truth, the birth of dependence. The world thought it had entered an age of recovery, but in reality, it had entered America's age, a financial empire built not by war, but by the simple act of being trusted. By the 1950s and 60s, the gold that filled America's vaults was no longer just a symbol of safety. It was the leash around the world's economy. Every foreign nation technically owned gold in U.S. custody, but whenever they tried to move it, politics intervened. Redemption required permission, and permission meant obedience. Quietly, the system of trust had turned into a system of control. France saw it first. President Charles de Gaulle, proud and defiant, declared that paper dollars were no substitute for real metal. He demanded that the United States return France's gold, sending warships across the Atlantic to collect what was rightfully theirs. To Washington, it was an act of rebellion. To the world, it was a revelation that beneath the polished language of cooperation lay an empire built on dependency. Each shipment that left New York's vaults shook the illusion of balance. The more gold departed, the more the dollar's confidence wavered. America realized that its supremacy rested on a fragile truth, that as long as the world believed it could exchange dollars for gold, it would never need to try. But if that belief ever collapsed, so would the system. So in 1971, President Nixon made the most consequential announcement in modern financial history. The U.S. would no longer redeem dollars for gold. The gold window was closed permanently. In a single speech, the promise that had held the global economy together was shattered. The gold stayed in American vaults, but the world's money no longer had a soul. And yet, paradoxically, America's power only grew. Because when everyone depends on your paper, it doesn't matter who holds the gold, only who writes the rules. When the gold window closed, the world didn't collapse. It adapted. Nations had no choice. Their reserves were tied to dollars, their debts denominated in Washington's currency, their trade priced through American banks. The U.S. had replaced gold with faith, a belief so powerful it became reality. The dollar was no longer backed by metal, it was backed by global dependence. Oil became the anchor. In the 1970s, secret agreements with Saudi Arabia ensured that every barrel sold worldwide would be priced in US dollars. This was no accident, it was strategy. The petrodollar was born, and suddenly, energy itself bowed to American currency. If a country needed oil, it first needed dollars. And to get dollars, it needed to trade with or borrow from the United States. The leash of gold had transformed into an invisible web, softer, yet unbreakable. Nations that once measured their wealth in tons of gold now measured it in digits on American-led ledgers. The world's richest vaults sat not in London or Paris, but inside the U.S. Federal Reserve's servers. Control had evolved, from physical possession to digital dominance. And still, most of the world never questioned it. They believed they had escaped the tyranny of gold, when in truth, they had entered the empire of paper, a realm where power no longer glitters. It prints. History rarely feels like theft while it's happening. For the world in the 1940s, sending gold to America wasn't surrender. It was survival. But decades later, the vault doors never reopened. The gold remained locked, silent beneath layers of secrecy and stone, as the dollar took its throne. Trust, once freely given, had been transformed into control so subtle that few even noticed. Fort Knox became more than a vault. It became a monument to faith. Inside, tens of millions of bars lie untouched, guarded by myths and soldiers, sealed away from public view. The last full audit was half a century ago. The cameras have long since been turned off, and the world has learned not to ask too many questions, because deep down, everyone knows the truth. When wealth leaves your hands, it rarely returns unchanged. Yet there's a strange poetry in it. Humanity's oldest symbol of value, gold, now sits still, while the paper it birthed races through satellites and stock markets, shaping the destinies of nations. The empire America built was not one of conquest, but of consent, and that makes it harder to undo. Perhaps that is the true price of trust. The world believed in America's promise of safety, and in doing so, built a system it can no longer escape. Every currency, every trade, every debt still echoes from that moment when gold crossed the ocean and never came back. And now, as nations quietly accumulate gold again, one question lingers in the shadows of Fort Knox. If gold built the last empire, what will build or destroy the next one?